to the Truthful Hope podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Vazquez. I'm really excited for today's episode. We're going to be discussing an interesting view held by many self-professing Christians, such as Francis Collins, called theistic evolution. And to avoid discarding their belief in Darwinian evolution altogether, this seems like something some Christians hold to in hopes of retaining their belief in God and with Darwin's theory. To help unpack this for us and show some of the serious flaws scientifically with theistic evolution, we have joining us now for the second time the Associate Director of Discovery Institute, Dr. Casey Luskin. Casey, thank you so much for jumping on again.
Great to be back with you, Jacob.
Yeah, well, it's great to have you back on. And in 2012, you wrote what I found to be a really interesting article called Deity Added. I know that was a long time ago, as we were talking about before this recording. But I think you did a great job of simply critiquing theistic evolution scientifically. So I'd love to unpack that further with you. You also more recently contributed to a pretty massive work here. I have it called Theistic Evolution for our readers. It's a really helpful tool, and it's not the shortest read. So if you're a reader, you'll love it.
It makes a great doorstop or, home defense weapon in the middle of the night. If somebody's coming at you, you can bash them over the head with it.
That's right. It's kind of like the On the Resurrection series by Gary Habermas. I usually tell people, if anyone says there's no evidence on the resurrection, there's 1,000 pages. If anyone says there's no critique on theistic evolution, here's about the same amount. But you did 2 chapters. You contributed 2 chapters, one on common descent and another on the missing transitions in the fossil record. So you've done your research in this. You're familiar with it. So I'm really excited to just break it open and clarify really theistic evolution and if it stands to be true. So let's just start at the top. What is theistic evolution?
Sure. So theistic evolution is basically the view that God used evolutionary mechanisms to create life. And as we get into this, I want to make it really clear, Jacob, that I am not questioning the Christian commitment of folks who hold to a theistic evolution view. I'm not here to say that they're not Christians. I'm a Christian. You're a Christian. I'm not at all saying that they're not Christians. But I do believe that theistic evolution view has a lot of problems, scientific problems, philosophical, logical problems, and theological problems. So I disagree with them, but I'm not here to, bash anybody's personal Christian faith commitment, those sort of things. Yeah.
That's helpful.
But so theistic evolution, very simply, is the view that God used evolutionary mechanisms to create life. And, the first thing I ask when somebody tells me that they are a theistic evolutionist is, well, what do you mean by evolution? And I think we talked about this last time, but there are sort of 3 broad standard definitions of understanding the word evolution. It can mean something as simple as change over time within a species, something a little bit more, much more evolutionary, like the common ancestry of all living organisms. Or you can take the standard evolutionary view that blind and apparently unguided mechanisms like natural selection, random mutation, genetic drift, etc., that those are responsible for generating the diversity and complexity of life. And so if somebody says they're a theistic evolutionist, I want to ask them, what exactly do you mean when you say you believe in evolution? Because depending on what they say they mean, their view actually might be much closer to intelligent design, or it might be pretty much just the standard Darwinian evolutionary view. We can dig down into what that means. Yeah.
That's really helpful to clarify. And it's good to rehash kind of what evolution is from what we talked about last. And for our listeners who have been tuning in regularly, you probably realize the theme of asking questions. And we always talk about, asking questions in your apologetics, because you don't want to assume somebody's view, and you'd rather really get a clear-cut answer or insight into what they truly believe. So that's a great way to start. When they say they're theistic evolutionists, you say, what do you mean by theistic evolution? And that should open up the conversation more. So that's really helpful. But in your article, you started with origin of life. And I really like that because origin of life is a really interesting field to me. It seems as if a lot of evolutionists, maybe not all, either purposefully or not, avoid this as much as possible because it seems like a very difficult topic on their view. Maybe just unpack origin of life and some of the limitations given evolution for theistic evolution and Darwinian, but specifically theistic evolution.
Yeah. So first of all, I do want to talk about the different definitions of evolution. And then we can talk
Sure.
about the origin of life.
Yeah.
Because if someone just says, look, I believe God used evolution, and all they mean is change over time within species, or, we can see that there's, maybe all cats are related, sort of like small scale change or change within lower taxonomic categories, then I'm going to say, okay, yeah, I mean, pretty much everybody I know, including all the Darwin skeptics that are out there, accepts change over time within species or even, limited change within groups. And so if you are a theistic evolutionist in that sense, that's not really a very informative, term to use to describe yourself, because, you might be an intelligent design theorist, you might be a, more along the lines of a standard evolutionary biology perspective, what you might call neo-Darwinism or something, some flavor along those lines. So where do you really land? It's hard to say. If somebody then says, well, I believe in the common ancestry of all living organisms, well, that is a lot more informative, or even like, say, human chimp common ancestry, and they believe, that somehow God guided that. Okay, now you're getting into more of just a standard evolutionary view. But even that view of common ancestry, if you believe it was guided by God, there are quite a few people historically who would have believed in common ancestry, but actually were supporters of intelligent design. They rejected sort of the view that the evolutionary process happens on its own and that it doesn't need any involvement from an intelligent agent. Somebody like Alfred Russel Wallace, who was not a Christian, but he was a sort of he was not a materialist either. He believed in some kind of an immaterial realm, and he believed he was the co-discoverer of natural selection alongside of Charles Darwin. But he later believed that the evolutionary process, at least what led to human beings, had to be guided by some intelligent force or some intelligent agent. So he was a design theorist, basically, an intelligent design proponent. And so, he would not be a standard evolutionary theorist who says it's just blind evolutionary mechanisms all the way down. But so you have to ask people, what do you believe? You do find folks out there who fully accept the standard evolutionary story. Folks like, I would say, Francis Collins, who fully accept the standard evolutionary account of how life arose and diversified, and yet they believe this is how God did it. Okay, so when we think of theistic evolutionists, this would be sort of the full-throated official version of theistic evolution. These are folks who would reject intelligent design, at least as far as the claim that we can scientifically and empirically detect design in nature. They think that when we look at the world scientifically, all we see are standard evolutionary mechanisms all the way down to the beginning of life. And so they basically take the official evolutionary view that the scientific community believes, that every atheist believes, and they just say, well, but this is how God did it. Okay. So let's just be very clear that this is sort of just, when you talk about folks, most of the folks who would affiliate with mainstream theistic evolution groups like BioLogos, like the Faraday Institute, they sometimes will call themselves evolutionary creationists. That's fine if that's what they want to be called. But this is the view that they take, that it's standard evolutionary mechanisms, really no divergence whatsoever from what mainstream evolutionary biology teaches, from what every atheist believes about how life got started, except they would say, and this is how God did it. Okay. So they don't believe you can see God, empirically speaking, in that process, but they do have faith that this is how God, the mechanisms that God used to create life on Earth. So if this is the view that they're taking, then sort of, in my view, the biggest problem with that view is that scientifically, that standard evolutionary account of how, life arose, that's chemical evolution, and then diversified, that's biological evolution, that standard evolutionary account has numerous scientific problems. And so to the extent that the evolutionary explanations for how life arose and then how life diversified, those sort of different questions, the origin of life and the evolution of life. But to the extent that those views have scientific problems, so does theistic evolution when that's the version, the standard full-throated theistic evolution version. If that's what they're adopting, then it has all those scientific problems as well.
Right. And that's super helpful. And I think that's where the questions come in, right? Because you get to clarify what they really mean. And sometimes they might subscribe to more of an intelligent design position, and you might be able to tell them, hey, that's actually intelligent design. That's not really the strict theistic evolution theory, which is
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
no, go ahead.
No, I mean, I've totally met folks who, I started talking to them and they said, oh yeah, I'm a theistic evolutionist. I believe God guided the evolutionary process. And then when you drill down to what they mean, they are actually a supporter of intelligent design because they believe that God guided it in a meaningful way where we can actually see that. Oh, they will say, I don't believe that random mutation and natural selection can build these complex features. I believe that God somehow had to have guided the evolutionary process, and you can see God's hand in the evolutionary process. Empirically speaking, if that's where they're coming from, then they are more of an intelligent design theorist than a theistic evolutionist. But of course, these are all just terms we use. We have to really drill down to what people mean. But yeah, I know a lot of folks out there who they're ID proponents and they don't realize it yet.
Right. Right. Well, that's so good. And yeah, we have to ask our questions. We have to clarify for their sake as well as ours. So it's a win-win for both parties. But with that said, maybe break open origin of life. And I know, the topics, origin of life especially, is a deep one. So maybe briefly just give a few limitations that evolutionists run into for our listeners today.
Briefly, well, I just gave an hour-long lecture on this about 2 weeks ago for a class that I'm teaching. So, I mean, I've got a lot of material to talk about. But the origin of life is supposed to explain how you went from basically inanimate matter to living cells that could self-replicate on the early Earth. And there's a number of steps that origin of life theorists will claim that had to have taken place in order for this to happen. It kind of starts with basically raw materials and, very primitive, short, tiny little molecules on the early Earth, which then experienced energetic interactions, which then led to more complex molecules, which like monomers, which then led to more complex molecules like polymers, which then led to things like RNA or proteins or maybe even DNA, which eventually led to basically living cells as we know them. And there's problems all throughout each of those steps in the origin of life. The first problem is that you got to explain how you sort of took those raw materials on the early Earth and formed prebiotic monomers. And one of the main, famous experiments that's cited is the Miller-Urey experiment, where they will claim, this was done back in the 1950s, that they took gases that were supposed to represent gases that were present on the early Earth. We're talking about like hydrogen, ammonia, methane. They zapped those gases with electricity. That's supposed to simulate lightning striking the atmosphere in the early Earth. And lo and behold, they created some amino acids. Okay, so give credit where credit is due. Amino acids, of course, are a very far cry from life, but at least they did that. Well, it turns out that the gases that they used in those experiments are no longer thought to have been present by geochemists on the early Earth. The early Earth's atmosphere is now thought to have been more dominated by carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, some water vapor as well, which could possibly have dissociated into oxygen, also some hydrogen, but not to the extent that would create a reducing atmosphere that's necessary to produce, get these Miller-Urey type experiments to work. So basically, they really don't have a good mechanism for generating some of the simple prebiotic monomers on the early Earth. Now, a few years ago, I'd say in the last 10 or 15 years, they made some progress generating nucleotides, again, a type of monomer that would be necessary as a stepping stone to generating RNA. And they claim to have done this using sort of, primitive Earth-like conditions. Jim Tour, who's a professor of chemistry at Rice University, has done a fantastic job critiquing some of these chemistry experiments, which are said to produce things like prebiotic monomers. And he talks about the fact that basically, when they do these experiments, they will start by buying large quantities of pure materials to start with, to start off these reactions. Large quantities of pure reactants that would never have been present on the early Earth. And then he talks about the fact that as they do these chemistry experiments, many steps have to be done in these synthesis experiments to produce a nucleotide. And in each step, the product that you produce is a very, very tiny amount. Now, in the primitive Earth, where you don't have a chemist who can orchestrate these experiments and each of these steps in these synthesis reactions, in the real world, you're not going to be able to start off with a large amount of pure reactant at the beginning. You're going to have only a tiny bit because each step yields only a teeny tiny amount of product. And in the real world, you would have to then start the next step in the reaction with that tiny amount of product. And the problem is what Jim Tour calls the mass transfer problem. After multiple steps of getting teeny tiny amounts of product at the end of each reaction, you're going to run out of material for future steps. And you're going to just have nothing left. And so that's another major problem. So again, how do they get around this? Well, essentially, they do what any chemist does. They buy large amounts of reactants, and they just start off the next step in the reaction series with large amounts of pure materials. That would never happen on the early Earth. And these materials, these organic molecules, often have very short half-lives. That means that if it is too warm, basically, then you will degrade these molecules so quickly they won't be around to be able to react in the next step. But if it's too cold, yes, you can then preserve some of these molecules. You can make the half-life of these molecules last longer. But in a cold environment, you no longer have these molecules undergoing chemical reactions. So heat in these situations is kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't. Too much heat, you destroy the chemicals you're working with. Not enough heat, you don't have enough energy, and you actually don't power these reactions to go forward. So, but let's just say hypothetically that you could somehow produce all these prebiotic monomers on the early Earth, things like amino acids, nucleotides, etc. Well, the next thing you got to do is you got to link them up to form polymers. This is called polymerization. The problem with polymerization is that polymerization reactions, yes, they can link up two monomers into a polymer, but they also generate a water molecule. And the famous environment that they want all of these chemical reactions where life supposedly evolved taking place is called what? The primordial soup. It's a water-based environment. And in a water-based environment, what happens? You don't form polymers, you break polymers apart because of Le Chatelier's principle. You're going to drive the polymerization backwards because reactions do not like to go forward in the presence of their product. So in the presence of a water molecule, the polymerization reaction is driven backwards. You break the polymers up and you don't actually get polymers. So the last place that you would want to have polymerization, which is a crucial step in the origin of life, you got to have a way to take these monomers, link them up to form larger molecules like proteins, RNA, maybe even DNA or whatever. You've got to have long polymers in order to get life started. And the last place you would want to do that is in a primordial soup type environment or underwater near a hydrothermal vent, which is another favorite location potentially for the origin of life. They like hydrothermal vents because there's a lot of interesting chemicals there. There's a lot of energy from these undersea hydrothermal vents, but you're trying to do it underwater. And they're also very hot environments where, again, the heat is going to destroy the organic molecules that you're trying to produce. But let's say that somehow you could produce all these necessary polymers. The next step in the origin of life is what we call clumping. You've got to get all of these polymers together in a sort of a small compartment encapsulated environment, something like what we have today where cells use a cell membrane. And inside of that environment, then they can have nice little protected space to have reactions and get life going. There have been some experiments that have produced things that folks have said could be primitive cell membranes. They call them protenoid microspheres or they call them coacervates. There's a problem. All of these hypothetical, primitive cell membranes, they don't do what cell membranes do in the real world and living organisms today. Number one, they don't metabolize, they don't grow the way that, cell membranes can grow. But number two, cell membranes in living organisms, they are these smart barriers. There are all kinds of molecular machines and carbohydrates and sugars embedded in the membranes of living cells. And what those machines and those molecules do is they keep harmful molecules out and they let helpful nutrients in, okay? And if you don't have a smart membrane, if you just have this sort of passive, little whatever you want to call it, some kind of protected membrane, it's never going to do the job to keep harmful molecules out and let helpful molecules in. And in order to get a cell membrane that actually does this very basic protective function that every cell membrane needs to do, you need molecular machines. And you're never going to have those prior to the origin of life. You're never going to have all these complex carbohydrates that cells put on the surface of their cell membranes to perform these functions. I'm sorry, it's just not going to happen. So I think there's a real problem with getting a cell membrane that can perform the basic functions of cell membranes today. Now, when I was an undergraduate at UC San Diego, I actually took an origin of life seminar that was taught by Stanley Miller. He was a professor at UC San Diego in those days. And I remember very clearly, I wrote down in my notes, he said this quote, he said, making compounds and making life are two different things. So it's one thing to get, a bunch of molecules, even if you can get these polymers, RNA, proteins, whatever, but it's a very different thing to produce life. And according to origin of life theorists, the first life would have been something like a replicating molecule. They would prefer it to be an RNA molecule. It's simpler than DNA. They think that RNA can both carry information, kind of like DNA does, and it can also catalyze reactions in some cases, at least, kind of like proteins does. So maybe RNA, the RNA world hypothesis proposes RNA as the first self-replicating molecule, the first form of life, which can hopefully perform both the information carrying function of life and the reaction catalyzation function that proteins carry out today. Many, many problems with the RNA world model. Number one, RNA has never been shown to assemble in the laboratory without the help of a skilled chemist intelligently guiding the process. Okay, so RNA just does not form. We are not aware of how to produce RNA under natural Earth-like conditions. Another point has been pointed out by a very smart origin of life theorist named Steve Benner. Actually, I got to meet him at a conference a few years ago, and that is that life, RNA in particular, needs a molecule that is inherently toxic to life and RNA, and that's called water. Okay, again, water destroys RNA, it breaks down polymers. Okay, and so it's kind of like the last place you would want for RNA to form would be in some kind of an aqueous environment without all the enzymes and other molecules that life has to prevent that kind of degradation from happening so quickly. So the bottom line is that forming RNA in a prebiotic environment, there's no evidence that that can actually happen. There's also no evidence that RNA can perform a lot of the catalytic properties of proteins. One paper said that when it comes to RNA functioning as a catalyst, it's basically 1 million times less as good at doing catalyzing reactions as proteins would be. So it's really not good at that. But this is not even the fundamental problem with the RNA world. The fundamental problem is that they are proposing a self-replicating RNA molecule. And theorists have proposed that this maybe needs to be about 200 to 300 nucleotides in length. So if you imagine trying to specify, just by chance, let's say somehow you do produce an environment that is just generating all these RNA molecules. Well, to get a self-replicating RNA molecule, you need to get a bunch of nucleotides in just the right order, okay? And the only mechanism you have to do that is blind chance. Again, we're assuming some magical environment that just produces lots of RNAs. What's the likelihood of getting the nucleotides in just the right order so that you get a self-replicating RNA? All of our attempts to do this in the lab, we can't even intelligently generate a self-replicating RNA in the lab. So what's the likelihood this is going to happen by chance? One theorist, Robert Shapiro, said that the sudden appearance of a large self-copying molecule such as RNA was exceedingly improbable. And he says the probability is so vanishingly small that it's happening even once anywhere in the visible universe would count as an exceptional piece of good luck. Stephen Benner raises a very interesting point. What he basically says is, if you look at what origin of life theorists produce in these RNA world experiments, is yes, they can produce RNAs that can do things. And the likelihood of producing an RNA that destroys other RNAs is much, much, much greater than producing an RNA that can basically make copies of itself, okay? So we have sort of like a fundamental, I think, defeater right there of this idea that you could get an RNA, self-replicating RNA molecule by chance, because you're much more likely to produce an RNA molecule that destroys other RNAs, not one that copies RNAs. That's just, we can see that in the experiments. So there's a real problem with the RNA world molecule right there, or model right there. So look, we could go on and on. The bottom line is that I could give you boatloads of quotes from mainstream scientists saying that we just don't know how life arose. Okay, I'll give you a quote from Venki. I'm going to probably mispronounce his name, but it's Venki Ramakrishnan. He's former president of the Royal Society and a Nobel Prize winner. And he wrote a book called Gene Machine that came out in 2023, published by Basic Books. And here's what he said. He said, "How life began is one of the great remaining mysteries of biology. The problem is that in nearly all forms of life, DNA carries genetic information, but DNA itself is inert and made by a large number of protein enzymes, which require not only RNA, but also the ribosome to make these enzymes. Moreover, the sugar in DNA, deoxyribose, is made from ribose by a large, complicated protein. Nobody can understand how the whole system could have got started. Every step of the way, Jacob, in the origin of life, you have fundamental chemical, logical, biological barriers. And these problems are really nowhere near being solved by origin of life theorists. So I give them credit for trying, and I respect their faith that they will someday, get it right. But we just don't. I just don't see the evidence pointing in the direction. In fact, I love the way Jim Tour has framed this. What he says is that the more we learn about the complexity of life, and the more we do origin of life experiments, we don't get closer to explaining the origin of life. We get further from it. And so the trend line of the data really is that the origin of life, we do not see a solution in sight. And you do see scientists frequently being honest and acknowledging that we don't have a solution to this problem, nor is one really forthcoming. So I think, if you're a theistic evolutionist and you're looking to explain the origin of life, and you believe that there is an intelligent being out there that made the universe, well, look no further. All right. What does life run on? Life runs on information. Okay. Information, the kind of information in the machine-like structures we see in life, they don't come about. We have no experience with those kinds of things coming about through natural mechanisms. Okay. Blind mechanisms don't produce the kind of information we see in life, the machines that we see in life. In our experience, those kinds of things only come about through intelligence. So if you already believe in some kind of a creator, an intelligent, supreme being, supreme God that created everything, why would you want to go into adopt a model for which there's really no evidence that it can produce the kind of complexity that we see in life? But you do believe in a cause that can produce that kind of complexity if you believe in God. So why would you want to adopt a theistic evolution view of the origin of life? I just don't understand why the evidence would lead you to that position. I'm sorry, it just makes no sense to me. There has to be some other reason.
Yeah, that is a great way to unpack origin of life. And you mentioned Dr. James Tour in the book Theistic Evolution. He actually did a chapter called "Our Present Proposals on Chemical Evolutionary Mechanisms Accurately Pointing Toward First Life." So right there, you have about 30 pages of Dr. Tour going all into that. It's funny too because you're mentioning all these models and ways that scientists are trying to kickstart origin of life. In every case, and you briefly mentioned this, it's design. They're showing that it requires design to kick off the first life, really. So I see that more as affirmation than anything else for intelligent design, personally.
No, I agree with you. I'm only one time did I hear of an experiment that I thought really accurately modeled the early Earth. And they went to some of those like bubbling mud pots in like a Yellowstone type environment, and they put a bunch of chemicals in there to see what would happen. All right. Of course, nothing happened. But at least they were trying to use what they thought would look like an environment on the early Earth. Other than that, the experiments that I'm aware of, they don't mimic natural Earth-like conditions. They really, and when you're not mimicking Earth-like conditions, you're showing that intelligent design is needed. And so I agree with what you just said very much. Yeah.
Right. So, well, that's great. I think that's super helpful. The next question, though, is another biggie: natural selection and random mutation. I know that's also another huge topic, but you said in your article, arguably, the evolution of life is where theistic evolutionists defer the most to orthodox Darwinian thinking. Um, what is natural selection, and then what are the limits? Because I know there's a lot of, let's call it, mysticism to natural selection. So maybe just unpack that for us a little bit.
Yeah, you will sometimes find theistic evolutionists who will acknowledge that we really have no explanation for the origin of life, and they may even, some might even think that there is room for intelligent design and seeing God's hand in the origin of life. But when it comes to the evolution of life, after life got started and its subsequent biological evolution, most of your standard theistic evolutionists are going to take the standard evolutionary view. And so what is natural selection? Well, natural selection is the idea that if you look at a population of organisms, you see variation. There's differences between individuals in a population. And some individuals are going to be better suited to survive and reproduce than others. And over time, those that are better able to survive and reproduce will tend to do so. They will tend to leave more offspring. And so a species will evolve in the direction of those individuals that are better able to survive and reproduce. I mean, that's natural selection in a nutshell. Basically, there's no intelligent agent that is guiding the process. It's just a natural event that happens that those individuals which tend to leave more offspring will do so. And the species will then evolve in their direction. And it's used, as you said, you talked about mysticism. It is sometimes used almost like a magic wand, okay? And you can see this actually in discourse from origin of life theorists. How did the first cell evolve? Well, they will say, well, once we got a self-replicating molecule, we don't need to explain any of that because natural selection, wave the magic wand. My colleague, Dr. Brian Miller, he actually has this Harry Potter wand, and he takes it to presentations to show people what they do. They just wave a wand. Natural selection can do it. No details required. No really, detailed explanations are needed. And so natural selection is seen as this just all-powerful force that can do whatever you need it to do. You don't need to fill in the gaps. And so that is sort of the quote unquote the mysticism that you mentioned. I think that's probably what you're referring to. There's some problems though with natural selection, namely, it requires. Okay, well let's bracket the efficacy of natural selection to spread helpful traits through a population. There actually is some real problems there, but let's assume it can do that job. Natural selection can only preserve traits that are already there, okay? And according to the standard neo-Darwinian view, traits have to evolve one small little mutation at a time, okay? The problem is that we're seeing many traits that require many mutations to be present before you get any selective advantage to help you survive and reproduce, okay? And so this really is the crux of the problem with natural selection. My colleague, Dr. Douglas Axe, who is associated with us here at the Discovery Institute, he did a population genetics study, and he asked the question, just how many mutations could arise in the whole history of life on Earth if you had to have a minimal number of mutations present before you get any advantage, okay? I'm not talking about a situation where every little mutation gives you a successive advantage towards survival and reproduction, okay? When you only need one mutation to give you some advantage towards surviving and reproducing, natural selection generally seems able to get the job done. I mean, there's some constraints. I read one paper that said just fixing one helpful mutation in a population like humans might take 6 million years, okay? But generally speaking, let's talk about bacteria. One mutation that's needed to give you an advantage, that can usually arise and spread in that population. But when you need more than one mutation before you get any advantage, then the likelihood of you getting both of those mutations in one organism, in one place at one time, starts to go down at an exponential rate. Let me give you an analogy to understand why it's so difficult to get multiple mutations coordinated together in one organism when all of them are needed before you get some advantage. Think of the example of a bike thief trying to open a bike lock, okay? And if that bike lock just has, one digit, and you just have to guess, basically, 0 through 9, you can probably get that lock open pretty quickly just by flipping through that 1, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You'll get the right magical, digit pretty quickly. And your chances of getting it by chance would be 1 in 10, right? But let's say now that bike lock has 2 digits in the combination. Well, now your likelihood of getting the right combo by chance is not 1 in 10, it's 1 in 10 squared, right? 1 in 10 times 1 in 10, which is 1 in 100. So now it's going to take you basically 10 times longer to find that right combination. Now let's say that you have 4 digits on that bike lock, and you need to be able to open up, get all 4 digits right before the bike lock will open up. Now the likelihood of you getting the right combination by chance is 1 in 10 to the 4th power, 1 in 10,000, okay? So with each digit that you add, with each new, new item that you need to get right, your likelihood of getting the right combination in order to open the lock goes down at an exponential rate, okay? It's the same thing with mutations. Getting one mutation may not be that hard, but with each new mutation that's needed to be present before you get any selective advantage, again, I'm not talking about a case where each mutation gives you an advantage. I'm saying when you need multiple mutations to be present before you get any advantage, with each mutation that is added, the likelihood of you getting all those mutations in one place and one time by chance goes down at an exponential rate. And it goes down very quickly. And so getting back to what Doug Axe calculated, he found that if a trait required just 7 or more mutations before giving you an advantage, it could never arise in the history of life, even in a population of bacteria, where evolution is supposed to have its best shot, right? Because bacteria, they have very, very large population sizes, very rapid generation time, very high mutation rates. Your evolution sort of has all of the probabilistic resources in its favor with bacteria to get lots of mutations going, okay? But again, if just 7 or more mutations are needed before you get an advantage, then what he found in his population genetics study is that you could not produce that trait in the whole history of life on Earth. But when it comes to doing that same kind of thing in animals, where we have much smaller population sizes, much longer generation times, much lower mutation rates, then the likelihood of getting multiple mutations before you get an advantage goes down even more. There was a paper in the journal Genetics published in 2008 that found that if you're talking about, say, a population like humans or hominids, that the likelihood of just getting two mutations that have to be present in order to give you some advantage, that would take over 200 million years to arise in a population of hominids, given, reasonable known population size of the hominids, their generation times, their mutation rates, etc. So what that basically means is that, look at the millions of base pair differences between humans and chimps. If just there's, something like 40 to 50 million base pairs that are different just in our single nucleotide variation, if just 2 of those mutations are necessary to give you some advantage, then they can never arise in the 6 to 8 million years since we supposedly shared our common ancestor with chimpanzees. And this is a problem throughout the evolutionary history of life on Earth, where, many, many traits would require many mutations to be present. I'll give one final example of this, and then I'll give it back to you, Jacob. But getting back to Doug Axe, he did research finding that an enzyme of fairly typical complexity called beta-lactamase, the likelihood of getting an amino acid sequence to yield a functional fold in a beta-lactamase enzyme is 1 in 10 to the 77th power, okay? What this tells you is that many mutations have to be present before you get a functional beta-lactamase enzyme. And this is an enzyme that I would say is a fairly typical complexity. So it's very representative of a lot of enzymes that would be out there in life, okay? If you would need far more than 7 mutations to be able to get to be present, already present all at once before you could get a functional beta-lactamase enzyme. What this tells you is that evolving the complexity of just your average protein throughout the history of life on Earth, random mutation, natural selection is not going to be able to do the job. This is mathematical modeling. This is empirically based evidence from experiments done on proteins. I think we can say that under other reasonable circumstances, folks would say that, look, yes, random mutation, natural selection, it's good at some things. It can cause antibiotic resistance to happen in bacteria. It can break features very efficiently. It can maybe cause, different eye colors or hair colors to arise. You want to get a rabbit that has a white fur coat so that it's camouflaged. It might be able to do that. But to produce highly complex features or even features of just average complexity in the history of life on Earth, I think that under normal circumstances, we would look at this mechanism, how inefficient it is. It's basically a blind trial and error process, and you would say, this is not the explanation for how these complex features arose. But for some reason, folks really are wedded to random mutation and natural selection, and they're not willing to question it. If you think that it's just ID people saying this, Lynn Margulis, who was a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences until she died a number of years ago, she said, neo-Darwinists say that new species emerge when mutations occur and modify an organism. I was taught over and over again that the accumulation of mutations led to evolutionary change, which led to new species. I believed it until I looked at the evidence. And she said, new mutations don't create new species. They create offspring that are impaired. So there's some serious problems with the mutation selection mechanism being the driving force to generate the complexity of life on Earth.
Thank you for unpacking that further, Casey. The other interesting part of your article that I found was what you subtitled Altenberg 16. I know before we start recording, you told me there is a more recent event. Spoiler alert, it's an event. But this specific one was from 2008. So maybe just unpack what it was and then explain the more recent event that occurred.
Yeah, so the Altenberg 16 was a group where basically 16 scientists from around the world convened in Altenberg, Austria. This was in 2008. And they basically discussed problems with the standard neo-Darwinian model of evolution. And the journal Nature, probably considered the world's top scientific journal, wrote a little story about this Altenberg 16 conference, as it was called. And they quoted very, very top scientists saying things like, the modern synthesis, that's the neo-Darwinian model of evolution. The modern synthesis is remarkably good at modeling the survival of the fittest, but not good at modeling the arrival of the fittest. Or they said things like the origin of wings and the invasion of the land are things that evolutionary theory has told us little about. So they were really challenging this basic fundamental ability of the neo-Darwinian model of evolution to explain the origin of new complex biological features. And this is sort of rumblings of something that I would call the third way evolutionary camp, which is a group of biologists who reject neo-Darwinism. They don't think that it's been very successful at explaining how new complex features arise, how the tree of life, why the tree of life is such a mess, many other sort of discoveries that modern biology is making. They are still evolutionists. They don't support intelligent design, but they also reject the standard neo-Darwinian model. And this viewpoint is actually growing in prominence. And some very interesting thinkers involved with this, folks like Dennis Noble at Oxford University, who I got to actually do a dialogue with last year, and Jim Shapiro, geneticist at University of Chicago. Shapiro wrote an article last year where he said, the ID argument has a valid point with regard to the explanatory limits of neo-Darwinism, still widely regarded as the only legitimate scientific explanation of evolution. And these are some great examples of folks who do not support ID, but also reject neo-Darwinism. There was sort of a follow-up to the Altenberg 16 conference in 2016, where the Royal Society of London hosted a conference that was basically devoted to looking at problems with the neo-Darwinian synthesis. And in sort of some of the promotional materials about this conference, they said that they would be looking at developments in evolutionary theory in adjacent fields that have produced calls for revision of the standard theory of evolution. And the opening lecture in that conference was given by an Austrian biologist named Gerd Mueller. And he focused on claims where he said the neo-Darwinian model does not explain what he called complex levels of evolution, things like the origin of body plans, complex behaviors, complex physiology, development, the origin of novel characters. And he said that the modern synthesis is focused on characters that exist already and their variation and maintenance across populations, but not on how they originate. And so he went on to then propose kind of like an evo-devo take on how body plans arise and new complex features arise. But the bottom line is that what this conference showed is that the neo-Darwinian model, it is being critiqued at the highest levels of the scientific community. Now, I don't think they have a good replacement model for it yet. In fact, I think that a lot of the third way evolution scientists, they're still looking for what I would call a coherent replacement model, okay? Evo-devo is interesting, but it has yet been shown to be able to produce new body plans and sort of that key evolutionary magic bullet that they need to find, explaining how fundamentally new types of organisms evolve. They still have not solved the problem that neo-Darwinism was not able to solve. So I wish them the best. I think that some of the third way thinkers are really interesting people with some great ideas, and they may actually contribute to our understanding of how life adapts to changes in the environment. I think they've done some really cool work, but they haven't really solved that fundamental problem yet. That remains to be done.
That's really helpful to know too, because a lot of people think Darwinian evolution is just a brute fact. It's always been the same. Darwin's theory remains, but really, in the scholarly realm, there's some talk. There's rumors about how to rehash it. So it's
very much so. No, very, very much so. Jacob, didn't mean to cut you off there.
Yeah. No, you're good. That's really good for our listeners to know.
If I could throw one more thing in, one interesting thing about neo-Darwinism is you can find a lot of these mainstream non-ID critics of neo-Darwinism have sort of lamented about the fact that they are pressured to not publicly speak out against standard evolutionary theory. Okay, so Jerry Fedor, who's a cognitive scientist and physicist, Massimo Piatelli Palmarini, they wrote a book called What Darwin Got Wrong. And they said in the book that they are atheists, basically. But then they said this. They said, we've been told that even if Darwin was substantially wrong to claim that natural selection is the mechanism of evolution, nonetheless, we shouldn't say so, not anyhow in public. To do that is, however inadvertently, to align oneself with the forces of darkness. And they went on to say that neo-Darwinism is taken as axiomatic. It goes literally unquestioned. A view that looks to contradict it, either directly or by implication, is ipso facto rejected. Entire departments, journals, and research centers work on this principle. Daniel Hillis, a computer scientist and member of the National Academy of Engineering, he said there's a strong school of thought that one should never question Darwin in public. Going back to Lynn Margulis, she obviously was a major critic of neo-Darwinism. And she said that honest critics of evolutionary way of thinking are often dismissed as if they were Christian fundamentalists, zealots, or racial bigots. And she said that those who critique neo-Darwinism become, quote, persona non grata in the scientific community. And she was a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. The point is that I think we would see a lot more criticism of neo-Darwinism if it were not for some of these pressures that these are mainstream non-ID evolutionary scientists who are basically materialist atheists who believe in some form of evolution, and they are saying that they feel pressured not to critique Darwinism, the neo-Darwinian model, or the standard evolutionary view. I find that very interesting, and it shows that I think evolutionary biology is not in a healthy place.
Yeah, definitely. That's well put. The last thing I want to talk about is what I find super interesting, and you've done a lot of work on this in your podcast and writing, and that's junk DNA. You said this in your article, and it's a bit longer of a quote, but I think it's important to state for our listeners. He said, theistic evolutionists love to argue that our cells are full of functionless DNA, which many call generic junk. And later on, you said, as the argument goes, God would never put, and this is from Francis Collins, God would never put useless DNA into our chromosomes, so we must conclude that random mutation and natural selection built our genome. Collins makes these implications clear when he said, unless one is willing to take the position that God has placed shared functionless DNA in these precise positions to confuse and mislead us, the conclusion of a common ancestor for humans and mice is virtually inescapable. That's a really steep claim about God. We'll put that aside. But what is junk DNA, and is there scientific evidence to show that Collins is right, or maybe he's wrong? Can you unpack that for us?
Yeah, great question, Jacob. So junk DNA is basically the idea that our genomes are largely full of DNA that doesn't do anything. It's basically evolutionary debris, the result of millions of years of random mutations that have basically bloated our genomes with junk that's not doing anything for you, the organism. And Francis Collins, very, very smart guy, very eminent scientist, head of the Human Genome Project, former head of the NIH, one of the most prominent theistic evolution voices. He said in his book, The Language of God, that some 45% of the human genome is what he called genetic flotsam and jetsam. If you're not sure what flotsam and jetsam is, that's basically trash floating in the ocean. Okay, so he's comparing 45% of the human genome to trash. And 45% is actually an estimate that I would say is on the low end. I can quote you from evolutionary scientists saying things that over 90% of our genome is junk DNA. Richard Dawkins once said 95%. I've even seen scientists saying that 98, 99% of our genome is junk DNA. Okay, so you can see people saying that huge proportions of our genome is junk DNA. All right, so is it right? No, it's now known that it's not right. In 2012, there was a huge paper published in Nature from the ENCODE Consortium. This was a project composed of hundreds of scientists around the world who were basically studying these non-protein coding DNA elements. That's part of what ENCODE stood for. And what they looked at is basically, is there evidence that the non-protein coding parts of our genome are biochemically active? And the answer is not only yes, it's yes in spades. They found evidence that over 80% of the human genome shows evidence of biochemical functionality. Okay, this is from a 2012 Nature paper. And what's really interesting is that after that paper came out, Collins actually changed his sort of lingo that he uses about junk DNA. This is actually what he said. This is quoted from a conference speech that Collins gave in January of 2015. So this was between 2 to 3 years after that huge ENCODE paper came out. He said, I would say in terms of junk DNA, we don't use that term anymore because I think it was pretty much a case of hubris to imagine that we could dispense with any part of the genome as if we knew enough to say it wasn't functional. There will be parts of the genome that are just, random collections of repeats like ALUs. Like that's the problem with what he's saying there too. But he says that most of the genome that we used to think was there for spacer turns out to be doing stuff and most of that stuff is about regulation. And that's where the epigenome gets involved, and it's teaching us a lot. So, wow, Colin's saying now, he doesn't use the term junk DNA, but yet in this quote, he's still saying that repeat DNA like ALUs, that he says it's probably not doing anything. Well, we know now that that's not true either. In fact, every time that evolutionists start to say that, okay, this is a piece of junk, we know it's not doing anything, lo and behold, we discover functions for that type of DNA. I'm in a dialogue right now with all these scientists that are saying that all the repeat sequences that are different between humans and chimps can be ignored as just genetic junk because they don't do anything. But yet there's papers in the literature that say that the DNA that's different between humans and chimps is functional. So what we see over and over again, and by the way, most of the people arguing this are theistic evolutionists. For some reason, they love this junk DNA argument. They love to see our genomes as cobbled together, the result of random mutations, not intelligently designed for a purpose. I don't know why, because they believe in an intelligent being, a creator God who could do this, who could create a very, highly functional genome. But for some reason, they consistently will miss the literature that is showing function throughout our genome, and they will just go with the standard evolutionary assumption that if you don't know what it's doing, it's probably junk. I've seen this more times than I can count over the years. It's very, very interesting, and I don't know what's behind it, but it's very unusual. Yeah.
So interesting, the walk back from Francis Collins from junk DNA. I was kind of stunned when you said that.
He walks it back, but then in the same quote, he's still holding on to it because he wants to say, well, these repeat sequences are junk. So it's not following the evidence. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. I've had, friends who subscribe to theistic evolution come to me and say, well, it shows God's more powerful. It shows God's power if he's doing that. And, there's theological reasons why that's not the case. But even if it were the case, you can't get the nature of God from your expectation. You have to get the nature of God from his effect, or else you're doing it the wrong way, because then it's your imagination, really.
What you just said, I've seen that too. People think that God should create this hyper smart, efficient universe that can build life using purely natural mechanisms. And yeah, God could do that if he wanted. God could do anything, okay? The question is, what does the evidence say? Does the evidence suggest that this is in fact the way God did it? And the answer is no. We don't see information-rich code, molecular machines, computer-like information processing, things that are at the heart of life. We don't see that in our universe doesn't seem to be able to produce those kinds of things through blind natural laws, okay? So we need some other mechanism. And for me as a Christian theist, I can see very good theological reasons why maybe God would not want to just use blind natural mechanisms. In the Bible, I'm speaking right now, I'm putting my hat on that I'm a Christian. This is not science, but in the Bible, we see many examples where God will do really cool things that nature doesn't do in order to let people know that he's there, okay? We see this like when Elijah poured a bunch of water on the altar, just to make it really clear that when, fire came down from heaven and it lit it on fire, this was not just a natural event, okay? This was God at work. And what happens after he does that? All these prophets of Baal go around screaming, oh my gosh, the Lord is God, because God revealed himself in this totally non-natural way. So there is good, and look at Jesus rising from the dead. That's where God actually, Paul says that God gave proof that we need to repent of our sins and turn to Jesus because God raised Jesus from the dead, a totally non-natural event, to let us know that something really important is happening here. We need to pay attention to it. God is at work, okay? So there is ample precedent from the Bible of God revealing himself by doing non-natural things. Sometimes, very often, God uses natural causes. I fully believe. I'm not saying that God doesn't use natural causes, and I'm not saying that when God does use natural causes, that somehow God is theologically absent. We get accused of that. No, 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 no. Never, never in a million years is any Christian theist who supports ID saying that, oh, if God works through natural mechanisms, that somehow God is, theologically absent in some cosmic sense. Not at all. God can use natural mechanisms, but he's not bound to only do that. As I think the way I like to approach it as a scientist is let's follow the evidence where it leads. If natural causes are the best explanation, let's go with that. But if an intelligent cause is the best explanation, we can use the scientific method to go with that too. We talked about that last time. So I think we shouldn't constrain our science by theological assumptions about how God has to act. Because if you are a Christian, you have ample reasons to believe that God could use natural causes or might not use natural causes. And again, to put my Christian hat back on again, why wouldn't God potentially want to reveal himself in the creation of life on earth? After all, Romans 1:20 says that God is clearly seen in what has been made. So we might have an expectation that God would reveal himself in the creation of life on earth and do something really interesting that just doesn't come about by natural mechanisms, to show that he is behind it all. He is behind you and me and life on earth. So if there's no theological problem with that view either. God could do it however he wants, right? He could have made a universe, a clockwork universe to create life. Some folks call that like deistic design, or deistic evolution rather than theistic evolution. Or he could, miraculously intervene, or he could do any number of other ways, to get life going where we might be able to detect design. The bottom line is I want to not assume what God did or did not do or could not do. I want to follow the evidence where it leads. God has freedom to act as he wishes. And for me as a Christian, that means when I want to become a scientist, I can just go and see what the evidence says. And this is what the early scientists thought they were doing. They were literally thinking God's thoughts after him, that God had freedom to create the world as he wished, and we can go and discover how he did it. And so that means that as a scientist, I don't have to let theology dictate what my answers have to be. I can follow the evidence where it leads. And I think that theistic evolutionists sometimes they don't do that when they tell themselves that God had to use only blind natural mechanisms. They're letting theology dictate their science. And I don't think that's a good way to do science.
Right. It's almost limiting in a way, and it's not letting the evidence lead you where it's pointing. And that's what you exactly said before. We should look at the evidence to look back to the effects, to look back to the cause, and that's natural theology at the heart of it. So, to our theistic evolution friends, I hope this was helpful. I hope it shed some light on some of the beliefs you have. And if you disagree, leave some comments. We'd love to hear from you, and we'd love to further the discussion. But Casey, it was really great having you on again. It's just so insightful listening to you talk about these things. So I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Jacob. A lot of fun, and I appreciate your great questions.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for joining, and God bless.